I'm fond of arcade games, and by that I mean the one where you have to sit down and put a coin in a machine to play. There's a thing in their game design that sets them apart, some kind of beauty and sophistication that we can really see in action in their modern descendants. Today I'd like to talk about one of those games. Even though its original version was on a computer, it too had a great success in the arcade. This game is Tetris, and more specifically, Tetris the Grand Master. You may have heard of it, but I want to go beyond the surface level spectacle of Invisible Tetris. I want to share with you the essence of this genuinely well-designed game. I'm Petit Prince, and for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to nerd out about the game design of one version of Tetris. Welcome to the beautiful design of Tetris the Grand Master.
Levy.
Okay then, Tetris, that little action puzzle game from a computer scientist in the Soviet Union, the killer app of the Game Boy, and probably one of the best-selling franchises of all time. Despite its tremendous success, many people think it's this one game, ported over and over again, with sometimes some funny gimmicks or graphical updates. This is of course false. The evolution of Tetris games since 1985 is a story for another time, but the skinny version is that there's two main branches to the Tetris family tree: Nintendo and Sega. It's more than your average constructor war, it's a deep difference in the platform itself. To oversimplify a bit, before you had the PC versus console debate, you had the arcade versus console debate. This is reflected in the gameplay of each and every title here. The one we're interested in is Tetris the Grand Master, a member of the Sega branch. It was made by Arika. It's a little company founded by ex-Capcom employees. At the time, their most notable title was Street Fighter EX, so a group of people familiar with the arcade environment. As you may have guessed, the Sega branch of the Tetris family tree mostly deals with arcade titles. Does that surprise you? People usually know Sega for Sonic, the Yakuza series or the Dreamcast, but people generally don't realize that Sega was and still is an arcade powerhouse. Okay, so arcade games. It's a whole different thing compared to what we are used to, isn't it? You have to get out, move to some other places, and pay each time you play. This has an impact on the game design. You see, and of course this is an oversimplification, the developer has to juggle between two parties with different interests. On one hand, you have the arcade operator. All they care about is money, and for a single-player game, it means that it should be short or difficult. Accessibility is also a concern. If a game is quick to pick up, it's more likely that a rando will have a go at it. On the other hand, you have the player. What they want is to have a good time and a good investment for their money. A game that's too difficult or unfair is not a good investment for their money. Do you know a game that fills those criteria? Well, look at the title of this video, it's Tetris of course. And in fact, the Sega arcade version of Tetris, on which TGM builds on, was a massive success in Japan. This cannot be understated. Not only did it perform better than legendary titles such as Final Fight or Outrun, but also managed to stay as a top 10 earner an incredible 9 years after its release. No wonder then that when Sakurai talks about puzzle games, it's this version he's showing. Side note, I'm going to use some NES Tetris footage as a representative of Vanilla Tetris, but bear in mind that this is not a diss against either this game or its players. The NES Tetris scene is a wonderful one filled with remarkable people, and I just needed an example that everybody knows. So, accessibility? It's practically a given with Tetris. You pick up the rule very quickly, and most if not all of its game mechanics are represented visually. Raise your hand if one of your parents picked up Tetris when you were young. The easy part of easy to learn, hard to master cannot be understated. How difficult is it? Well, that's up to the hard to master part. Let's put aside that Tetris is NP hard thingy that only people with a computer science degree can understand, And let's take another route to explain why Tetris is hard. At its core, Tetris is a pattern matching game. This in itself doesn't make it a supremely difficult game. Yes, there's a huge number of game states, but the principle of good stacking boils down to 2 sentences. Don't make holes and build mostly flat. Once you've internalized that and learned some basic pattern, at level 0 it's really hard to mess up. In fact, with the rules of nowadays standard Tetris, it has been proven that you can play forever, so it's really up to you to be responsible for having a clean stack. I would even argue that this fills the fairness checkbox. Even if you had a terrible distribution, it's still up to you to prepare for this. Now, what makes Tetris interesting to play, and the source of its difficulty, is the gravity mechanic. As you play the game, the speed at which the active piece falls becomes quicker and quicker.
Consequently, you have less time to think, but also less time to move the piece.
It's as much an execution problem as a mental one. However, there's a finite limit to the speed of the game. Past a certain point, you end up in a kill screen where it is impossible to play. In NES Tetris, the maximum speed is reached at level 29, where the piece falls at a rate of 1 block per frame. Without some controller shenanigans or an exceptional luck, you will find yourself topping out very quickly. Note that 1 block per frame is an arbitrary constant set by the developers. Nothing prevents them to set a rate of 2, 3 or 4 blocks per frame. And if you continue to push this to its limit, you end up at 20 blocks per frame. At this absurd speed, the piece falls to the ground immediately, and you find yourself powerless, unable to do anything. Can you?
Ready.
So, how do you survive the kill screen? You could try to make the piece move faster, but as you can see, this is not enough. There's really not much you can do. The piece spawns on the ground immediately with no air time whatsoever and then immediately locks. We call that in the Tetris jargon a 20G speed, G being some sort of unit of gravity. In order to survive at this speed, you need to introduce something new. Now, if only we could move the piece when it's on the ground, then we could go somewhere. Enter lock delay. Lock delay is the mechanism in which if a piece falls into the ground or the stack, it will not immediately lock. During that time, it can react to the player inputs and slides for a few frames before eventually locking into the stack. This is exactly what we needed, and this has deep consequences. This completely recontextualized the game, from its moment-to-moment tactics to the general strategy on where you should put the pieces. Can you guess why? At high speed, and especially at 20G speed, the piece movement becomes severely limited. Not only you have to think about the current piece placement, but now more than ever you have to take the next piece into account. It is even sometimes beneficial to make suboptimal piece placement so that future pieces can be safely placed. As they say, a small concession to the greater good. And thus, while the core gameplay stays the same, the game becomes more and more demanding, both physically and mentally. You have to react faster and input your command both quickly and confidently. At the same time, you have to constantly think about your stack, the zones where work is needed, and how you can accommodate unwanted pieces. With 20G, you enter a newer area of the game where on one hand, the piece placement options are drastically reduced, but on the other hand, you can still somewhat keep those options by stacking in a very particular, very pyramid-y way. The stacking logic you had at level 0? Change it. You need to apply new strategies in order to keep this pyramid shape going. What's remarkable with Tetris the Grand Master is that not only it has found a way to extend the base game past this seemingly impossible to overcome limit, but it is also fully aware of that and focused nearly all of its game design effort toward this idea of speed, this 20G speed. Speed is really the name of the game, and if you don't believe this, there's a giant timer at the bottom of the screen that acts as a constant reminder. And to continue with this racing analogy, there's a finish line at level 999. Lock delay is probably the most important gameplay element added to Tetris. But it's not the only thing in which TGM innovates. Other additional mechanics were introduced or refined, and they all have this common idea of making 20G play more viable. Little by little, mechanic by mechanic, you transform a part of the game that's normally reserved to the elite 1% player into a more normal, albeit more demanding game. Let's go through them, shall we?
Levy.
Let's start with dash. Dash is the Tetris jargon term for holding left or right to automatically move a piece. It's a natural thing to do, you have probably already done that on a computer keyboard. More pragmatically, the problem dash solves in TGM is not only an easier 20G play, but also some easier advanced movement techniques. You basically transform a tricky key combination that has to happen in one frame into a much simpler hold lever plus press button that can be done at your leisure. Implementing this game mechanic is subject to some subtle yet important details that have to be fine-tuned. There's actually two parameters to take into account. First is how fast the repeat is, and second is how fast it is triggered. In TGM, the repeat rate is really fast at 1 block per frame. Compared to the 6-ish frame of NES Tetris, this is really fast. TGM here prioritize the here, i.e. the piece position, instead of the how, i.e. the inputs that leads here. The dev probably thought that mashing the control stick was seen as a poor form. I wonder what they think about the hyper tapping and rolling technique that we can find in NES Tetris. Okay, now activation delay. In TGM, it's actually the same as in NES Tetris, which might be puzzling considering the fact that it's not really viable at max speed. However, there's another mechanic that makes it so.
Levy.
This mechanic exploits the small interval between each pieces. So yes, there's a small pause between each piece distribution. It may be surprising to have a pause in a game that's all about speed. But even though nothing happens on the screen, it doesn't mean that the player has to stay idle. Indeed, you can, and oftentimes should, use this time to charge the dash. This is arguably a small concession to the game rhythm, but this makes 20G play much more viable. Again, regarding the piece placement, there's a greater emphasis on the where instead of the how. But then, why restrict yourself to horizontal movement? How about also buffering rotation commands? The jargon term for that is RRS, and it's exactly that. Hold a rotation button during the interval time, and then the piece will spawn already rotated. This serves two purposes. First is to solve the pointy end toward the ground problem that stems from the Sega Tetris initial orientation. In a nutshell, it's easy to get a J or L piece stuck in a pothole due to the way those pieces spawn. Second is to ease the burden of having to rotate a piece that's on the stack. If a piece comes already rotated, then there's no mental gymnastics to see whether a wall kick will activate or not. And more importantly, there's no chance to fumble the button manipulation.
Levy.
I mentioned Wallkicks just now, but haven't introduced you to them yet. So let me introduce you to this other important mechanic. This is another one that involves automatic movement, and it really opens up the game, especially so at 20G where everything is magnified. So, Wallkicks. A wall kick can happen whenever you try to rotate a piece that's near a blocked cell, such as the stack or a wall. Normally, if the rotation mask overlaps a blocked cell, the rotation will fail and the piece will stay as it is. However, with Wallkicks, the piece can automatically move so that the rotation can still happen. In nowadays standard Tetris, the Wallkick rules are quite complicated to follow, at least to my eyes, but it enables some advanced movement techniques, such as the infamous T-spin triple. In TGM, however, it's dead simple. Try to move the piece one block to the right or one block to the left in that order. If the piece fits, then commit the rotation. Wallkicks makes the game smoother and subscribe to the notion that any piece should be able to rotate most of the time. At least, it was conceived as such. But more importantly, it gives other options to fill holes in your stack. In particular, you have options to fill them from the side instead from the top. In 20G, you have no control over vertical movement, so having more of them horizontally is a welcome feature. So far we have seen changes that relate to the active piece, the main point of interaction of the player with the game. But that's not the only way you can improve Tetris. Sometimes you have to literally think outside of the box.
Levy.
So now for something completely different. Let's talk luck. Earlier on, I mentioned luck in the context of fairness. Any competitive Smash player can tell you this. Consistency is king in a competitive game. That's why randomly tripping in Smash Ball was so negatively received. It's a random and unmanageable event. You can probably see where I'm getting at. There's one giant thing in Tetris that's by definition random. The way the pieces are distributed. No worry, we can make this fair. This may come to no surprise to you, but TGM has an optimized random generator. In fact, most Tetris games have one. A complete history and analysis of the different random generators is a story for another time, but here's the gist from a TGM perspective. In a purely random sequence of pieces, a sufficiently long series of S and Z tetrominoes is bound to appear. Such sequences is mathematically proven to lead to a game over. Of course, this doesn't happen in practice, and especially in TGM where there's a finite number of pieces given. The chances of that happening is simply too small. However, this does give us an insight about what is a good or bad piece distribution. Flood and dwarf, too many or not enough pieces of a given piece type, are no fun at all. In other words, waiting for that long bar piece is painful. So how does TGM counteract this? Well, it implements a history system that prevents recently given pieces to be distributed again. This is a flood prevention measure and it makes the game much more consistent while still having an element of unpredictability. Side note, being unpredictable is not a bad thing. In the context of Tetris, I think the heart of the game is for the player to think dynamically about the piece placement. If the sequence was already predetermined, the game would be about command execution instead. And while perfect command execution is like the basis of most speedruns, I prefer doing high-speed pattern matching instead. So anyway, most of the randomizer theory comes down to improving the consistency of a piece distribution. This is not a concept that's directly linked to the notion of speed, but it does make the game better to play. Being confident that you will not be screwed by the piece distribution algorithm is a big plus, especially at high speed. So TGM implements a randomizer that's consistent while still keeping some unpredictability, and that's a big improvement over a purely random one.
Levy.
So far I've described TGM in terms of pure game mechanics, but it turns out the game is so focused on speed that even the graphics is designed for that. I've already mentioned the time counter at the bottom, but let's look at other elements of the UI. First, look at the stack, and notice how the active piece contrasts with the rest of the stack. There's a clarity of graphics that comes not only by the fact that the locked pieces have a darker luminosity, but also because of this white border. There's a 1 pixel white border that surrounds and highlights the stack. The goal here is to have an instantly readable playfield. Continuing with this idea, each piece type is color-coded, so that way you can read a piece not only by its shape, but also with its color. With this, you focus your gaze on the stack and let your peripheral vision do the rest. Focusing on the stack and the active piece makes you see more easily other nuggets of information. Notice how the active piece becomes darker and then flashes when it locks. This lets you know without any shadow of doubt when you are clear to charge the DAS or IRS. The next piece window is carefully aligned with the stack, directly above wherever it will land. This helps to determine where to place the next piece because in some way it is already part of the playfield. I noticed that when playing Puyo Puyo Tetris. Somehow having the next piece window on the side really messed me up. Speaking of unconscious effect, the whole series is known to have this auditory gimmick in which each piece type have its own jingle. As you can see, clarity and good feedback is what TGM is striving for.
Levy.
So, we have some focused game mechanics, focused graphics, and even a specialized random algorithm. That's all good and well, but what would be a good arcade game without a long piece measuring contest? Let's talk about scoring. Scoring in TGM lets you work with 3.5 metrics: time, level, score, and grade, the latter two being closely tied together. Time is a straightforward metric. Remember that this game is a race to level 1000, and for player who has grandmastered the game, it's the main point of comparison. As we're going to see later, the bare minimum is 13 minutes 30 seconds, but the very best compete in the sub 10 minutes range. Only a handful of players in the world can reach the sub 9 mark. Level is an interesting metric. In other games, it's a measure of how fast the game is. But here, in TGM, level is used in a slightly different mindset. It's not a speedometer, but a progression gauge instead. So, you know that at level 100 you are at the beginning of the game, 500 is the mid-game, and 900 is the last push. The way you increase your level is by simply surviving, as each new pieces increment the counter by 1. Also, for each line you make, you gain 1 bonus extra level. So, a Tetris will get you a nice +4 bonus, a triple a +3 bonus, so on and so forth. With this, you have a nice progress meter, and your very first goal as a TGM player is to reach level 1000. Finally, we have the score metric. Interestingly, it is not displayed in the leaderboards. What you have instead is a grade. A grade is like a belt in martial arts. It's an indication of the skill you have. I suspect it's also a way to take into account the fact that there's no two identical games because of the randomizer, but I have no proof of that. Anyway, like the Q-Dan system, it starts at 9, then you climb up to grade 1, and then you reach the upper grades that goes from S1 to S9. And then, finally, you have the highest grade, GM. While the sequels features complicated grading systems, in TGM1 the grades are simply linked to some score thresholds. And because of those thresholds, you may wonder how the points are counted. After all, the way the scoring system works will define how you will play. The score formula looks like this, and yes, it's a bit unwieldy at first sight. But my main takeaway is that it really puts a big emphasis on making several lines at once. So, you want to make as much Tetris and triples as possible because it's better for your score. However, it's not the only nudge toward this playstyle that the scoring system provides. It all has to do with how the best grade is evaluated. You see, it's not only a point requirement, but also a time requirement. There are several hidden checkpoints that you have to clear by making X point on level Y with a time of Z or less. The final checkpoint is the only one I bothered to remember by heart. You have to reach the end of the game before 13 minutes 30 seconds. Consequently, you have to play fast, for instance by soft dropping as much as possible, or by manually locking before the lock delay expires. But doing so doesn't necessarily lead to a game with a lot of Tetris and triples. You could be messy as hell and still play fast. There's a simple tweak to this though. Have a long line clear animation. In TGM, for a game focused on speed, it's very long, a little more than half a second. With all this, you are incentivized to play a game that's clean, meaning with very few holes in the stack. Having holes will more often than not force you to clear singles, making you lose time. Conversely, Tetrises and triples are even more encouraged, so that you spend as little time as possible on line clear animations. Playing clean and fast are now synonymous. Now, this is a type of speed that's unique to TGM1. In the sequels, the speed aspect takes more of a survival quality, whereas here, it's more a mastery of your stacking technique. One thing I'd like to point out before moving on is that it's a speed that's enforced by the game. Looking at the broader Tetris community, you can definitely find faster Tetris games, particularly in the 40-line sprint category. But this speed is intrinsic. It's the player that's crazy fast, not the game itself. In TGM, the speed is extrinsic. It's the game that's crazy fast, and it's up to the player to be up to the task. One isn't necessarily better than the other, but the path TGM chooses is coherent with its arcade roots. You make your best to present to the player an ever-increasing challenge, even if you lose the less skilled one on the way.
Levy.
Okay, TGM1 created, or at least refined, this brand new segment of the game we call 20G. But there's always room for improvement, right? Indeed, and TGM got 2 sequels, so what changed? I don't want to delve into too much details because I want to keep this video compact and focused, but I still want to give you enough information so that at least you can understand what those various videos are really about. 20G in TGM1 was a static affair. Once you get there, the game stays the same until the end. Can you restore some sense of progression? Yes, of course. In the case of TGM2, it is done by reducing the lock delay duration. You don't get a better expression of this than in the dedicated 20G mode. This mode is called Death Mode, and this is an extreme mode. Reaching the maximum speed here flirts with what's humanly possible. You really, and I mean really, have to be on point about your piece placement. But the design effort of TGM2 weren't only in the service of elevating the skill ceiling. It was also about promoting consistency. In that regard, there's 2 big things that were added to the TGM1 formula. First is the inclusion of an instant drop. This considerably speeds up the sub-20G game. And as a secondary effect, it also makes overhangs, a common occurrence in 20G, less of a time sink, effectively making sub-20G strategies more similar to the 20G ones. Second is an overhaul of the grading system. The same sets of grades exist, but they are awarded differently. Instead of being tied to the points you make, you have to fill a series of gauges that are not only hidden to you, but also constantly leaking. You do that by clearing lines, and only if you can fill one of those gauges can you reach a new grade. Again, the idea is to promote consistency, because by taking time to correct your mistakes, your grade gauge gets empty, and thus you get stuck on the current grade. A good player shouldn't get stuck for too long on a problem. If you can prove to the game that you are consistently good enough, you are not only judged by your performance with the grade gauge, but also on your time, then and only then you are able to take the ultimate test, Invisible Tetris. At first, it's a survival challenge where you have to survive for 1 minute. Surviving that will net you the nice GM grade. For me, Invisible is mostly a game that tests skills that are outside of the main TGM credo, but having next to no practice in this mode, I cannot say that much about it. So, for TGM3, the idea of consistency was pushed even further. It has now an account system. So now, not only you are graded on a single game, but you are also graded on your several last games. There's an account grade that can be increased only by completing a special promotional game, or even decreased by failing a demotional game. So when Kevin Didier reached the GM grade, not only did he play a GM grade once, but he could also pull it off consistently for the last 7 games or so. But of course, this idea alone is not sufficient to release a new game. Some big mechanical tweaks were also made. And now I have no choice but to talk about the Tetris company for a bit. Those people are the rights holder for the license. They include the man Alexei Pajitnov himself, but also Hank Rogers, the guy who initially brought the license to Nintendo. Now, for better or worse, starting from the early 2000s, the Tetris company began this habit of mandating gameplay elements. You just cannot release a Tetris game, meaning a game that bears the name Tetris, without also including, for instance, the standard Tetramino colors. It's still the case today, and that's the reason I talk about standard Tetris all the time. For TGM3, back in the day, those elements were 3-piece preview and arguably the controversial hold function. Those additions were not bad. By bringing much more information about the future and to extend the possibility to manipulate it, you have a much more tighter control over the game. Combined with the newly introduced flow kick, a mechanic similar to Wallkicks except now you rotate against the ground, this lets you reach new heights in terms of speed. I mean, look at the sheer insanity of the Death Mode's replacement. This mode is called Shiraze. Translated from Japanese, this means more or less obituary. Truly, it's something that's past death.
Overall, TGM3 is the ultimate expression of speed, as codified by TGM1 and Sega Tetris before. It lacks some of the tactical decisions you had to make in TGM1 and 2, but again, you won't find any Tetris that's, by design, faster paced.
Time for me to conclude. What general lessons can we learn from TGM from a game design point of view? I'm just a random dude on the internet, and I'm not even an outstanding TGM player, but let me suggest one. Brevity. There's this textual let's play I keep thinking about. It's about Mask of the Betrayer, the second extension to Neverwinter Nights 2, a CRPG from 2006. During a story recap, just before the game finale, Lieutenant Danger provides us with the following analysis of the game. Too often in games, I find some puzzle, some encounter that could have come from anywhere. In Mask, though, I struggle to find wasted space. I've mentioned it before, but it bears repeating. There are no irrelevant side quests. Every quest and every NPC ties back to the core themes in some way. This relates to the game story, but there's no reason we can extend this to the gameplay itself. If, looking back at your game, you can say it's a game about X, hence Y, you may be onto something. That's why remakes and sequels that go quote-unquote back to their roots can be so interesting to watch. Yes, sometimes it's just a shameless cash grab that panders to the nostalgia, but sometimes it's also a perfect chance to remove craft and focus on the core of the game. It may be an overused meme at this point, but look at what Zelda Breath of the Wild did for the franchise. Now, brevity alone isn't sufficient or even necessary for a great game. For a game focused on the gameplay, a competitive game if you will, depth is a paramount quality to keep the player engaged. But too often the depth of a game is hidden behind layers of complexity. That can be a hindrance to both new players and the ones who doesn't feel like constantly consulting a wiki. That's where TGM concise arcade game design helps. There's really not that much game mechanics to learn, and they all have this connective tissue of being either an extension of the base game or having a consistent internal logic. And those core mechanics are used and reinterpreted not only throughout a single game, from the pleasant pace of level 0 to the constant challenge of 20G, but also throughout the entire progression path of a player, from learner player to master player.
Knowledge is half the battle though, you still have to execute on it. There's really no way around this. TGM can be hard, especially on the latter part of the progression through TGM 2 and 3. That being said, you are not exactly required to have champion level reaction time and precision, even though honing those physical skills definitely helps. Oftentimes, intelligent planning can get you through a difficult spot by avoiding it altogether or turning it into your advantage. Being creative in your downstacking and not just waiting for a lucky sequence of pieces is something an innovator type of person can look forward to. So yeah, for me, TGM is a complete game,
elegantly designed, infinitely replayable, flexible in its time investment, and fun from many points of view and level of skills. It's for those reasons, and probably more, that I like this game so much.
And I'm not the only weirdo thinking that. It has been more than 20 years since the first game came out, and a small but dedicated community of players have managed to form. We've migrated from RC channels to message board to Discord server and are still stacking on. Thanks for watching.